In 2016, Sherri Papini vanished while jogging, sparking a nationwide search. Weeks later, she reappeared with a shocking story of abduction. But the truth was even more shocking. It was all a hoax. Today, we'll uncover how her lies unraveled and what really happened. If you're into uncovering shocking true crime stories like this one, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more cases coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Sherri Papini grew up in Northern California, living a relatively quiet life before becoming the focus of national media attention. She was married to Keith Papini, a man who worked as an audio-video specialist. The couple lived in Redding, California, a small, close-knit community where they were raising their two young children, a son and a daughter. By all outward appearances, the Papinis were living a typical suburban life, marked by family routines and involvement in their children's upbringing. On the morning of November 2, 2016, Sherri Papini, a 34-year-old mother of two, set out for a jog near her home in Redding, California. It was a familiar routine for Sherri, who often ran along the rural roads near her neighborhood, and nothing about the morning seemed out of the ordinary. According to her husband Keith, she was expected to be home in time to pick up their children from daycare later in the day. However, by the afternoon, something seemed off. Keith Papini arrived home from work and quickly noticed that Sherri wasn't there, which immediately raised alarms. She had not picked up their children, something that was completely out of character for her. Concerned, Keith began trying to contact Sherri, but she wasn't answering her phone. After several unsuccessful attempts to reach her, he used the Find My iPhone app to track her phone's location. The app led him to a spot about a mile from their home, along a stretch of road where Sherri was known to jog. When Keith arrived at the location, what he found was disturbing. Sherri's cell phone was lying on the ground, and her earbuds were coiled up with strands of her hair tangled in them. The scene was strange, almost too neat, but the sight of her personal belongings left Keith fearing the worst. He immediately called 911, reporting his wife's disappearance and expressing his deep concern that something terrible had happened to her. Within hours, law enforcement was on the case. Sherri Papini was officially reported missing, and a search began to locate her. Authorities, including the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, combed the area, looking for any clues or evidence that could lead to her whereabouts. Search teams scoured the rural roads, forests, and fields near where her phone had been found, while helicopters were deployed to cover more ground from the air. Keith Papini quickly became a central figure in the search, making emotional pleas for his wife's safe return. He appeared devastated, speaking directly to the media, asking the public for help and offering a $50,000 reward for any information that would lead to Sherri's recovery. As the hours turned into days, the situation grew more tense and frantic. The local community rallied around the Papini family, and volunteers joined in the search, distributing missing person flyers and coordinating efforts to spread awareness about Sherri's disappearance. The media quickly picked up the story, and it gained national attention within days. Sherri's case became a sensation, with many outlets comparing her disappearance to high-profile cases like the abduction of Elizabeth Smart. The media was captivated by the story of a suburban mother seemingly vanishing without a trace during an ordinary morning jog. News networks, both local and national, followed the case closely, providing constant updates as new details emerged. Keith Papini, Sherri's husband, played a central role in keeping her case in the public eye. In the days following her disappearance, Keith made multiple public appeals pleading for his wife's safe return. His emotional statements were heartfelt and raw, capturing the anxiety and fear he felt as days passed without any signs of Sherri. He described how much he loved his wife and the devastation her absence had brought to their family. Keith spoke directly to whoever may have taken her, saying, "Bring her back. We're not going to stop looking." His pleas quickly gained the attention of the media, which began covering Sherri's disappearance extensively. News networks interviewed Keith and other family members, and the story of the missing mother of two began to spread across the country. Sherri's case soon became a major media story with constant updates on search efforts and any new developments. The intense media coverage helped raise awareness, and tips from the public began pouring in from across the country. Unfortunately, many of these leads turned out to be dead ends, but investigators followed up on every potential clue, hoping for a breakthrough. As the days stretched into weeks, the fear of abduction began to take hold. Law enforcement officials began to publicly acknowledge that the circumstances were suspicious and pointed to the possibility of foul play. The lack of physical evidence and the unusual nature of Sherri's disappearance heightened these concerns. Investigators began expanding their search efforts, casting a wider net geographically, while also considering that Sherri could have been taken far from Reading. Roadblocks and checkpoints were set up, and missing person alerts were spread across neighboring counties and states. The community's anxiety continued to build as more time passed without any answers. The longer Sherri remained missing, the more people feared she had been abducted or worse. Authorities tried to balance the public's growing concern with maintaining a focused, fact-driven investigation. However, they also made it clear that they were exhausting all available resources to find her. Despite the extensive search efforts, investigators remained frustrated by the lack of substantial clues. The cell phone, the earbuds, and the absence of any eyewitnesses led to a deadlock in the case. Law enforcement expanded their investigation, conducting interviews with Sherri's friends, family, and anyone who might have had contact with her in the days leading up to her disappearance. They also worked with the FBI and other agencies to explore all possible leads, including reviewing surveillance footage from local businesses and traffic cameras. During this period, social media played a crucial role in keeping the case alive. Friends and family launched online campaigns to raise awareness, and hashtags like #FindSherri were shared across platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. The public's interest in the case continued to grow, and the online conversation around Sherri's disappearance kept the pressure on law enforcement and the media to provide updates. On November 24, 2016, Thanksgiving morning, Sherri Papini was found alive on the side of a highway in Yolo County, about 150 miles south of her home in Redding, California. She was discovered by a passing motorist who immediately contacted law enforcement, stating that they had seen a disoriented woman waving for help, bound in restraints. When authorities arrived, they found Sherri in a disturbing physical condition. She was emaciated, bruised, and had a chain wrapped around her waist, connected to her wrists. Her long blonde hair had been cut off, and she had visible injuries, including bruises and burns on her body. She was also covered in dirt and appeared exhausted, with signs of significant physical and emotional trauma. Sherri was rushed to the hospital for medical evaluation and treatment. Doctors confirmed that she had lost a considerable amount of weight during the 22 days she had been missing. She had several visible injuries that indicated she had been physically harmed, though their exact cause was not immediately clear. Sherri was in a state of shock and reportedly struggled to communicate, appearing dazed and confused when she was initially questioned by authorities. During her interviews with law enforcement, Sherri claimed that she had been abducted by 2 Hispanic women on the day she disappeared. According to her account, these women had been driving a dark SUV when they abducted her while she was jogging near her home. She said the women spoke mostly Spanish and had kept her chained up, moving her between different locations during her captivity. Sherri provided specific details about her captors, describing them as 2 women wearing masks, one older with straight black hair, and the other younger with curly hair and thin eyebrows. Sherri's description of her captivity was harrowing. She claimed that she had been physically assaulted multiple times, restrained and deprived of proper food, leading to her malnourished state. According to her, she was kept in a dark room for most of the time, her captors only letting her out to use the bathroom or when they physically abused her. She said they cut her hair as a form of humiliation and branded her skin with a hot tool, a detail that would later be confirmed by doctors who examined her at the hospital. Sherri said that despite the torture, she didn't understand why the women had taken her or what their motive was. She told investigators that, to her knowledge, no ransom had ever been demanded. According to Sherri, her captors decided to release her without any explanation. She claimed they had driven her to a rural area and left her on the side of the road in the early morning hours of Thanksgiving Day, where she managed to flag down a passing driver. Despite the shocking nature of her story, Sherri was unable to provide much information about the specific locations where she had been held. She told investigators that her captors kept her blindfolded whenever they moved her, making it difficult for her to know where she was or how much time had passed. In the immediate aftermath of her reappearance, law enforcement began an intensive investigation to verify Sherri's account and track down her alleged abductors. The FBI became involved in the case, assisting local authorities in their efforts to identify the two women Sherri had described. Sketch artists worked with Sherri to create composite images of her captors based on her descriptions, and these sketches were released to the public in the hopes that someone might recognize them. The investigation also included forensic analysis of Sherri's injuries and physical condition, as well as a detailed examination of the clothes and restraints she had been wearing when she was found. Law enforcement hoped these items might provide crucial evidence, such as DNA or fibers, that could lead to her captors. Sherri's brand mark, in particular, was of significant interest, as investigators believed it could provide a unique clue to help them identify the individuals responsible. As the investigation into Sherri Papini's disappearance progressed, doubts began to emerge about the details of her story. While her initial account was harrowing, with descriptions of being abducted by two Hispanic women, physically assaulted and held captive for 22 days, investigators started noticing inconsistencies in her narrative. These inconsistencies raised serious questions about the legitimacy of her claims and complicated the search for the alleged captors. One of the first issues came from the description Sherri gave of her abductors. She had provided detailed accounts of the women, describing them as masked and speaking Spanish, but there were no significant leads or corroborating evidence to suggest that these individuals existed. Despite extensive searches, law enforcement couldn't find any witnesses who had seen these women or the dark SUV Sherri claimed they had used to abduct her. Composite sketches based on her descriptions were widely circulated, but no one came forward with credible sightings. The lack of physical evidence to support Sherri's story created growing skepticism within law enforcement. Investigators also struggled to find any surveillance footage that could confirm Sherri's movements or the presence of the supposed kidnappers. Redding, the area where Sherri went jogging, had limited surveillance coverage in the rural roads where she had reportedly been abducted. However, when investigators expanded their search to areas where Sherri might have been held or transported during her captivity, they came up empty-handed. In a case with as much media attention as Sherri's, police hoped to uncover some evidence of her captors on security cameras, either during the abduction or in the weeks that followed. But there was nothing. No footage showing the SUV, no sightings of Sherri being moved between locations, and no sign of the two women she had described. In addition to the lack of physical evidence, Sherri's injuries raised further questions. While she did exhibit physical signs of trauma, including bruises and a brand mark, medical experts were unable to conclusively determine whether these injuries were inflicted by others or possibly self-inflicted. The nature of her wounds, particularly the branding, was unusual. Investigators noted that her injuries seemed inconsistent with the kind of violence she described enduring for over 3 weeks. There were also questions about the way her hair had been cut. Sherri claimed it was done by her captors as a form of punishment, but investigators couldn't confirm this definitively. Moreover, the timeline of events during her captivity remained unclear. Sherri's account was vague on certain key details, such as how she was moved between different locations, what the women's motivations were, and why she was released. Her inability to recall certain elements of the abduction also troubled law enforcement. While trauma can cause gaps in memory, investigators found it difficult to reconcile her story with the evidence, or lack thereof, they had in hand. As investigators delved deeper, other details began to emerge that complicated the narrative. According to Sherri's story, her abductors kept her in a room and allowed her very little contact with the outside world. But there was no indication of any ransom demand, no apparent reason for her release, and no evidence that she had been transported across a large distance. In fact, law enforcement was perplexed by the decision to release her at all, given the severity of the alleged crime. This suspicion became more pronounced as new details surfaced. For instance, the FBI conducted DNA testing on some of the items found on Sherri's body and clothing after her return. Surprisingly, DNA from an unknown male was discovered on her clothes, but it didn't match the profile of her husband or anyone in her immediate circle. This finding raised questions about whether Sherri had been with someone else during her time away, but it didn't match her story of two female captors. As more inconsistencies piled up, law enforcement officials began to publicly express their doubts about the case. While they remained professional and focused on finding the truth, it was becoming clear that Sherri's kidnapping narrative was falling apart under scrutiny. Investigators were frustrated by the lack of clear answers and began exploring alternative explanations for her disappearance. Though they continued to pursue leads and follow Sherri's story, their growing doubts would soon point them toward a much different conclusion about what had really happened during those 22 days. In 2020, 4 years after Sherri Papini's dramatic disappearance and reappearance, the case took a major turn. What had initially been treated as a tragic kidnapping case began to unravel when law enforcement uncovered a crucial piece of evidence. DNA found on Sherri's clothing was matched to her ex-boyfriend, James Reyes. This revelation would ultimately expose the entire abduction story as a hoax. The breakthrough came as part of routine investigative work. When Sherri was found in 2016, forensic evidence was collected from her body and clothing. Among this evidence was male DNA that didn't match her husband, Keith Papini, or anyone known to have contact with her during the search. For years, this DNA remained unidentified. However, in 2020, through advances in forensic technology and the use of genetic genealogy, investigators were able to link the DNA to Reyes, a man Sherri had been involved with romantically before her marriage. With this new lead, investigators tracked down Reyes and conducted an interview. What they discovered from him was shocking. Reyes admitted that Sherri had not been abducted by strangers as she had claimed. Instead, she had willingly stayed with him during the 22 days she was missing. According to Reyes, Sherri had contacted him in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, asking for his help to run away. She claimed she was in an abusive relationship, though investigators later found no evidence to support this claim. Reyes explained that at Sherri's request, he picked her up on the day of her so-called abduction and drove her to his apartment in Southern California. During her stay, Sherri was not held captive or mistreated in any way. Reyes told investigators that she spent most of her time in his apartment, occasionally helping with household chores. According to Reyes, he didn't question her reasons for wanting to hide and agreed to let her stay with him for as long as she needed. Over the course of the 3 weeks Sherri was missing, she inflicted injuries on herself to support the kidnapping story. Reyes confirmed that Sherri cut her own hair, bruised herself, and even asked him to help her brand her shoulder, an act that would later be used to make her story of abuse and captivity more convincing. Reyes admitted he reluctantly agreed to her demands, though he remained confused about why she was orchestrating the entire scenario. As the investigation deepened, authorities were able to corroborate much of Reyes' account. Cell phone records and other evidence showed that Sherri had been in contact with him before her disappearance. Furthermore, surveillance footage and interviews with Reyes' neighbors confirmed that Sherri had been at his apartment during the time she was missing. These findings directly contradicted her story of being held captive by two unknown women. Reyes's confession, combined with the mounting evidence, allowed investigators to piece together how Sherri had staged her own kidnapping. They learned that she had devised the plan to disappear and had gone to great lengths to make the public and her family believe she had been abducted. The question that remained, however, was why Sherri had done it. In March 2022, 6 years after her supposed abduction, Sherri Papini was formally charged with making false statements to federal agents and committing mail fraud. These charges stemmed directly from her fabricated kidnapping story, which had consumed significant law enforcement resources and garnered widespread public attention. The investigation into her false claims, once uncovered, revealed not only the deception behind her disappearance, but also a series of financial crimes tied to her lies. One of the key charges against Sherri involved mail fraud, specifically related to the donations she had received through a GoFundMe campaign that had been set up during the time she was missing. The campaign raised over $49,000 from sympathetic members of the public who believed they were helping a mother who had been kidnapped and needed support in her recovery. However, as the investigation into her disappearance exposed the truth, that Sherri had not been abducted but had stayed with an ex-boyfriend during her supposed captivity, it became clear that the funds raised were obtained under false pretenses. The GoFundMe campaign had been heavily promoted by Sherri's family and supporters during the early days of the investigation, and the money was intended to help with the costs of finding her and aiding in her recovery once she returned. After her reappearance, the funds were also used to help cover expenses for her and her family. But when the hoax was revealed, prosecutors argued that Sherri had knowingly deceived those who donated, leading to the mail fraud charges. In addition to the fraud, Sherri was charged with making false statements to federal agents. During the investigation, she had repeatedly lied to law enforcement about the circumstances of her disappearance, maintaining the story that she had been kidnapped by 2 Hispanic women despite knowing it was not true. These lies had not only misled authorities but also wasted considerable resources, including man-hours, forensic testing, and public donations toward the search effort. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including DNA linking her to her ex-boyfriend and a confession from him that she had orchestrated the entire event, Sherri ultimately chose to plead guilty to the charges in April 2022. As part of her plea agreement, she admitted to fabricating the kidnapping and acknowledged that she had lied to law enforcement and defrauded the public. By pleading guilty, she avoided the possibility of a longer sentence had the case gone to trial. In September 2022, Sherri Papini was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 36 months of supervised release. The sentence was seen as a significant punishment, given the emotional toll her actions had taken on her family, community, and law enforcement. During the sentencing hearing, U.S. District Judge William Shub stated that her actions had caused considerable harm, not only by wasting public resources, but by creating unnecessary fear and suspicion within the community. Sherri's legal troubles did not end with the prison sentence. In addition to the time she was ordered to serve, she was required to pay more than $300,000 in restitution. This included compensation to the California Victim Compensation Board, the Social Security Administration, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI, all of whom had expended significant resources in response to her false claims. The reaction from Sherri's family and the broader community was one of shock, disappointment, and betrayal. Her husband, Keith Papini, who had been one of her most vocal supporters during her disappearance and reappearance, filed for divorce shortly after her guilty plea, citing irreconcilable differences. In his court filing, he also sought custody of their 2 children. Keith expressed deep hurt over the lies and deception, stating that Sherri's actions had not only devastated their family but also misled an entire community that had rallied to support her. In the end, the legal consequences of Sherri Papini's actions served as a stark reminder of the real-world harm caused by false reports and the abuse of public trust. Her sentencing brought some closure to a case that had baffled and disturbed many, but it also left lingering questions about the deeper reasons behind her actions and the lasting impact on those who believed in her story. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting and want to see more true crime breakdowns, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more cases coming, so stay tuned and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.